Hello pals, welcome back to the channel. So this is episode 3 and potentially the final episode of the Modern Magic series. So what have we learned so far? Well, in episode 1 we looked at service patches from Cutting Edge Aviation and NASA, and we found that there was a lot of occult and esoteric influences. In episode 2 we looked at some of the organizations that have directly influenced science and technology, with some of the leading figures contributing to the moon mission and an immeasurable amount of progress that we've made with technology and modern culture. And in this one, we're going to be doing some time hopping, and we're going to look at the wizards in uniform themselves. So there are certain people through history that just don't seem to fit in organizations that are so strict and regimented. There were people dabbling in the occult and not afraid to look behind the curtain, to look at all the weird stuff and try and explain reality. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour through history. I could have made this into about 4 episodes, or I could have made this episode about 4 hours long, but I'm trying to keep it relevant to that central thread of UAP and mysterious practices and technologies being central to how we understand the world today, even if it's something that officially doesn't exist. So with that, we're going to start with a tangent. So there's a psychological term known as the jester's privilege, and this is the ability of a fool, or somebody seen as a fool, to criticize directly those in power, heads of state, kings, queens, nobody is immune, and to act almost without normal societal rules, regulations, and oversight, because they are seen as somebody only worthy of mockery. And this works in 2 ways. So it can be a carefully curated and constructed technique by the jester themselves to allow them to work more or less in the shadows or off the beaten track of normal cultural accepted behaviors. But it can also be weaponized against people. And there's no better example of this than ufology itself. The Air Force Office of Special Investigation and many others have poked fun at the subject over the years, so that now we're at a point where military professionals, pilots, doctors, you name it, have all come forward with their accounts, and it just can't crack through into normal society because of all the connotations of little green men and 50s sci-fi and X-Files music that comes with it. There's no better example of that than the men who stare at goats. And what we're going to do first is look at one of the central characters.
My name is Bob Wilton. I'm a journalist. I've been investigating a story about a classified government program.
The movie openly says that it's based on a top secret true story, and yet all of the characters and the events in the movie are so amplified that they become a parody of the true events. But the fact of it is that the American Army and the CIA were deeply invested in improving the American Joe and turning them into a super soldier capable of perceiving threats and ambushes, to kill at a distance, to manipulate energy. And the mastermind behind all of this was Major General Albert Stubblebine, seen here in the movie attempting to run through a wall. So then, let's attempt to peel back the parody and talk about the real Major General Albert Stubblebine.
Most people wear blinders. Okay? They wander through life looking through a tunnel.
Tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision. What I did was to try to take the tunnel and take the blinders off.
He was an United States Army Major General, and in fact he was the commanding general of INSCOM, a US Army Intelligence and Security Command. He was responsible for incredible developments of cutting-edge technology and techniques to give the army the upper hand. And he was a very serious character. He won the Bronze Star, he won the Legion of Merit. He was also responsible for commissioning and developing what the US Army referred to as the Big Five, game-changing weapons platforms brought in after the Vietnam War. This was the Apache attack helicopter, the M1 Abrams battle tank, the UH-60 Black Hawk, the M2 and M3 Bradley fighting vehicles, and the Patriot air defense missile system. Many of these are still in use today, which shows the incredible discernment that he had to see a potential and bring it to a reality. And as for INSCOM, well, it's very difficult to really get across just how essential and integral they are to American military dominance. But I found a video where they describe it themselves, so get ready for some extreme Americana, and I'll let them describe it.
INSCOM provides trained and ready intelligence forces to the combatant commands and defense intelligence agencies, intelligence-specific capabilities and services to the Army, and executes multidisciplinary intelligence operations in support of the Secretary of the Army's priorities. INSCOM does this with 17 major subordinate commands, or MSCs, geographically dispersed around the globe. 6 MSCs support Army Service Component Commands and combatant commanders. 2 MSCs support U.S. Cyber and Army Cyber Commands. 4 MSCs support the National Security Agency. INSCOM has an additional 5 functionally oriented MSCs under its direct operational control. INSCOM Foundry trains tactical, operational, and strategic intelligence soldiers around the globe, advanced technical and systems skills that ensure the Army possesses an elite professional intelligence force that supports throughout the spectrum of competition.
Good God. Anyway, you can imagine that the guy in charge of all of that would not be the type of person to try and run through a plasterboard wall, as he was ridiculously depicted in The Men Who Stare at Goats. But one thing that he did see great potential in was the Stanford Research Institute. In fact, Stubblebine was a major sponsor of Project Stargate with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff in the 70s. But to tell the next part of the story, this is where the web gets really convoluted, as I said at the start. So really, to handle this properly, we're going to have to go back to the 50s.
November 5th, 1955.
In the 50s, the Cold War was officially underway, with Russia, America, and its allies all desperately developing new, magnificent machines like the Vulcan and Lightning behind me to give them the edge in any coming conflict. But this wasn't just a mechanical war. Following intelligence that Russia had been developing psychic soldiers and working on the brainwashing of prisoners of war, America was catalyzed to act and play catch-up as quickly as they could. And this meant looking in some very strange places at some truly extraordinary people to give them the edge. And it was this spiritual arms race that led to the discovery of Andrei Puharich. Puharich, born in Illinois, became a captain in the Army Medical Corps, where he would rub shoulders with members of the Pentagon, Office of Naval Intelligence, and of course the Army, leading to his connection with Stubblebine. He was later responsible for recruiting Yuri Geller from Israel's Mossad and bringing him to America, where he could be studied for his mediumship and contact. And they had numerous UAP encounters, something which Geller in modern day refrains from talking about, but it was an extremely prominent part of their early interactions. Puharich was an avid inventor. He came up with 50 patents, which he said he channeled all from a non-human intelligence called the Nine, also known as the Ennead, the Egyptian gods. And perhaps that's where the modern military and NASA obsession with the Egyptian gods comes from. He had a very profound relationship with what he thought was Horus, the Egyptian god known as a falcon, and that had numerous bump points through his life. He also inspired a great teacher and esotericist, Jeffrey Mishalov, who himself had several encounters with a falcon which nudged him along his path to doing what he does today, which is inspiring and teaching thousands of people all around the world about esotericism. But it was this channeling that really got the attention of the Army and the Air Force and the CIA. The CIA attempted to recruit Puharich directly, to which he always flat refused. And later, when Puharich was out on business, a house full of his most prominent students, known as the Space Kids, was the subject of an arson attack, almost killing everybody in the building. At a later meeting with the CIA, Puharich said that they very heavily implied that this was them strong-arming him into the fold, and again he flat refused, although he would go on to be a consultant to both the CIA and Stubblebine during his studies of esoteric and extrasensory perception throughout his career. He also had a very strong and repeated contact with UAP, and this fascinated him. In fact, he believed that he had a watch which was directly controlled by a non-human intelligence and would feed him codified information. This is perfectly represented in the movie Interstellar, how the watch conveys a message from what is at that point a non-human intelligence. But he was incredibly important to what we now consider to be solid parts of history, with remote viewing, the Monroe Institute, and a host of others. Here's a clip from one of many talks and seminars he did about the UAP phenomena, where he goes into great detail about some of his meetings and initial interactions with these non-human intelligences.
And sure enough, the next night, Peter comes to my room. He said, we gotta go. It was, I don't know, 12 midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't recall exactly. And so we go out of the house, bitter cold winter, you know, it's Maine. And I put my shoes on. I didn't go down barefoot like Peter did. And it was about a half mile to the seashore. It's our own property, so we just went across the field, went down the cliff to the seashore, and again, we just waited. Peter said, they told me I gotta go. So same thing happened. Suddenly there appeared in front of us, it wasn't very big, I'd say 13 or 14 feet in diameter, spacecraft. Again, an orange glow to the hull, and suddenly these three wizened ancient beings come in their tight-fitting suits, and they just levitate in the air. And I honestly don't know how long we were there, but I would say at least 5 or 10 minutes. The same process. They were staring at us, and we were hypnotized by them. I didn't know what, if any, information was being transferred, and suddenly they disappeared. And Peter and I walked back, and we tried to figure out if we got any signal from this staring. And neither one of us did. But that was the beginning, the first step of my personal experience with UFOs and their occupants.
Marty! You've got to come back with me!
Where?
Back to the future!
Now, there's never a good time to do this, but I just want to take a quick second to say thank you very much for being here. Every like, subscribe and share makes a massive difference to the growth of the channel, and an extra enormous thank you to everybody that's been down to the store and got yourself something like one of these t-shirts or any of the other stuff down there. It makes a immeasurable difference, and it really helps me to do what I do. So thank you very, very much. Sorry for interrupting, and let's get back to the show. And so this is where we meet Stubblebine's apprentice and future successor, Colonel John Alexander, where he, after an experience of what's known as Point Man syndrome in Vietnam, where he was fighting a retreat and had a disembodied voice in his head tell him to stop. When he looked down, he saw that he was bending the wire on a tripwire, which would have set off landmines and done terrible things. And this set him on a course of investigation into the paranormal, which continues to this day. He has studied esotericism and shamanism in over 100 countries, along with his wife. And when he took over from the role of Stubblebine, first being given the role of head of human technology and then taking over as head of INSCOM, this finally gave him the flexibility and the freedom to explore the esoteric to the depths that they did. And really, this is where SRI were losing a lot of their funding from the CIA, and this was a role which INSCOM then filled. So, in fact, most of the more famous successes that we know from SRI, things like finding the crashed Tupolev 22 and the heavy investment into Faraday cages and remote viewing, was actually sponsored by INSCOM at the behest of Colonel John Alexander. Now, if you're wondering who SRI is and want to know in a bit more detail, well, I've already made several episodes, and in fact, the whole series, the Psychics and Sources series. So rather than retread old ground there, I recommend that you check those out. But what I'm trying to get over in this episode is that it was a hell of a lot more than just remote viewing that was going on there. In fact, they were involved with a fantastic character, the actual inspiration for Doc Brown from Back to the Future, Jack Sarfati. And I've managed to interview Jack a couple of times. And here's an interview that we did on the UAP files where he talks about what the CIA were really interested in with the formation of SRI.
Of course, okay, now I have to go back 1973. I have to go back. You read How the Hippies Say Physics. I'm at Stanford Research. This is how I met Hal Puthoff in 1973, 50 years ago, right? And in the course, you read How the Hippies Say Physics by MIT Professor David Kaiser, best-selling book, 2011. And in that thing, I made all these spooks. And this guy, George Cooper, actually, that was 2 years later, but right around that time. And this guy from the DIA, CIA, and I'm being funded by the Army Tank Command and the U.S. Air Force, partly being funded by them in this so-called physics consciousness research group. So how they say physics. And one day, George, I think this guy Saul Paulson is with me, and George says, Jack, there are two things the CIA really wants to know and wants you to figure out if you can. One, how does consciousness work? Physics. Okay. Two, how do flying saucers fly? 1975, guys. That's almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of yours and Russell Targ's work at that time.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Did you see?
some...
Okay. Did you see the meeting? It's the recording of my meeting in 1973 with Russell Targ and Puthoff at SRI. It's on SoundCloud.
Oh wow! No.
Oh yeah, and you'll hear Russell talking about they think flying saucers are time machines from the future. In 1973.
We'll have to go.
And I talk about my contact, from the computer on the board the spacecraft in the future. You hear Russell talking about it.
Following the defunding and eventual deconstruction of SRI in the 1990s, Colonel Alexander would need a new laboratory in which to perform his investigations and experiments with the unknown and esoteric. And this would come in the form of the National Institute for Discovery Science, headed by the enigmatic Robert Bigelow. Now, I could make a whole episode talking about Robert Bigelow, but because he's not strictly integrated with the military or intelligence, I'm not going to do that right now. But he was a huge contractor and involved with space flight, making inflatable pods which could be used in space, and in fact have been used on the International Space Station. And later in his involvement with the unusual, he bought Skinwalker Ranch and now has formed the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, or BICS, which have awarded prizes for proving life after death and involve many other prominent figures in UAP and the study of consciousness. But for now, we're going to focus on NIDS themselves and some of the primary characters. But just before we do, if your head's a little bit scrambled with all the hopping around through time that we've done, Here's a quick timeline which just explains the primary characters, who they work for, and their interactions of what we've covered so far, and it shows a little bit of what's coming next. So we begin in the 50s with Puharich, experimenting with ESP, healing, and the channeling of entities, specifically the Ennead, the old Egyptian gods, the Nine, with a strong connection to Horus. This was connecting mysticism and esotericism with things that may be of military interest. Then, as the Cold War grew and information came out about Russian experiments with brainwashing and psychotronics, the US funded studies into psychic warfare and remote viewing. This catalyzed the formation of SRI and their work with Uri Geller, a prodigy of Puharich, alongside Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. Then experiments were conducted to describe distant targets with high accuracy, which led to adoption formally by the military. This introduced people that we consider legends today, like Joe McMoneagle, who was Remote Viewer 001, and we've covered previously in the Psychics and Sources series. In the 80s, Albert Stubblebine, who was head of INSCOM, becomes a key advocate and pushes for research to create American super soldiers, leading to the truth of the story from the film The Men Who Stare at Goats. John Alexander follows in his footworks and particularly studies non-lethal weaponry, which loosely encompasses things like consciousness research and the projection of attention and manipulation of mind waves. Broader public interest leaks out through some of the various successes, and yet the program remains classified. Into the 90s, CIA declassified Project Stargate, which led to immense public attention, and then the subsequent defunding and collapse of SRI. But those figures didn't go away. They continued into research in the esoteric, either through NIDS or direct involvement with the military themselves. Now, before we move on, I just want to show you a quick clip of John Alexander, bearing in mind the history and the many investigations that he's done, discussing the true technology of UAP and its links to consciousness.
Do ETs have the technology? Do we have the technology? How do we know what's ours? How do we know it's not? What?
The technology. One thing almost everybody agree, even the believers say haven't been able to crack it in reality. And my example is, if an F-35 crashed in the Amazon and the Karina Quarry picked it up, you'd probably have better spears, you know, but you wouldn't understand flying and stealth and all of that. And that seems to be, I mean, almost in the rumors that come back and just say, don't understand. Now, there are those who say, no, we've been flying it for a long time. And I think that's bullshit. And the reason is, if you had the technology and could fly it, the issue is not little widgets flying. It's about understanding technology that's fundamentally different. You can make the Middle East irrelevant. And in fact, in one of my books I wrote to that, because I write little vignettes of what would happen, and it was that zero-point energy source is discovered, and it changes the geopolitics of the world, which it would. And so that you would take this and go make a little widget to fly, inconsequential compared to understanding. Now, we also looked at what would it take if you did understand such an energy. And our best guess is, at least 2, probably 3 decades before you could inculcate that. And you can see examples of that right now with electric cars. because you're talking about, the big question of, okay, where are recharging mechanisms and all that? To put in that infrastructure takes decades. So you would get started well ahead of time. So I think the idea that we've had it and sequestered, and that the other flip side is usually, well, the oil barons and all that would just bury it because they want to keep theirs going. I say, no, they would own it. They would just go out and buy it. Well, we have the concentration of wealth as we do in the U.S. Right now. Now, the people with money would just, invest in that and buy it. There's no need to be afraid. Again, the damn issue of complexity. Do these events happen? Oh, absolutely happen. But having said that, again, you get back to the interactions of humans and sentient non-humans. We've been having abductions. Remember Rip Van Winkle? And there's one that's in the Quran, and this notion of going to sleep or bilocation, and that has been around forever, and not necessarily that some ET snatched them up and moved them there. Why does it come? Are there, they call it cloaked memories, and changing it to make people think that it's something else? See, one of the things I mentioned earlier on the Cash Landrum case, helicopters flying around absolutely weren't there, and have looked at that and said, but can I make you think they're there? Can we do thought projection so that, that these things are being projected, so the recipients they're reporting what they actually see, but that's because something that's being implanted directly into the brain. But you're back to, what do you mean by UFO? And you say, where do they come from? If it's an interdimensional thing, then you don't have a problem of that. And you also don't have a problem of physical space, of where are they? Now, having said that, as if it sounds highly negative, conversely, again, if you're talking this finished over to the near-death arena and the mediums, and they talk about the spirit world that's very, very close to us and aware of what we're doing and interacting, and it's, physically right here, immediately adjacent. It gets you away from a lot of the problems of, like I say, time and distance and things of that nature. But it's, worth considering, certainly. But that gets you away from necessarily that there's a fixed base that's there, that's in three-dimensional reality as we know it. Is this in something that has other dimensions? And so it's not physically taking up space, and you've got to get there. Because we know where Mount Hayes is, and, having said that, have heard for a long time, about UFOs flying into and out of mountains and mesas. It's much rarer than the typical UFO story, but certainly there. You must remember something I haven't hit. One of my first questions always is, what do you mean by a UFO? And the problem is, I got little balls of light, got hard craft miles across, literally, and thousands of variations in between. Mm-hmm. Which, in my view, argues strongly against, by the way, the ET hypothesis, putting together. If, on the other hand, you say this is a mental construct, and you're seeing different things, again, you're back to consciousness, that certainly makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. Colonel Alexander would go on to be a consultant for the National Institute of Discovery Science, alongside the likes of Hal Puthoff and Jacques Vallée, who are also interwoven throughout this story and timeline that we've been discussing. But I want to finish really with looking at one more figure, and that is Colm Kelleher. So Colm Kelleher is somebody that I would love to get the chance to have a conversation with. He has a PhD in biochemistry and specializes in virology and neurodegenerative diseases, which we know from Gary Nolan's work it's pretty bad for the brain to come into contact with a UAP at close distance. When he was working with NIDS, he became the assistant administrator and research director. And within a couple of months, he was stationed on Skinwalker Ranch, the property owned by Bigelow at the time. But as fascinating as that was, and he had some bananas encounters with orbs of different colours and having different effects on people. And he was particularly interested in the hitchhiker effect, whereby people would come into contact with something paranormal, whether it be poltergeist activity or a UAP or even direct contact with a cryptid. Yes, a cryptid. And then would seemingly take the effect home with them, and it would pass on to their friends or other people in their areas, something that a virologist would find absolutely fascinating. But it was after his time with NIDS, NIDS being a private entity, that he was signed up by the DIA into ORSAP, which was I need to check my notes, it's late, Advanced Aerospace Weapon Systems Application Program. Now, this being under the DIA, this was a government-sponsored program. Obviously, Bigelow and NIDS was very entwined with Colonel John Alexander working there as well. But to bring this back under the moniker of an official Pentagon, and yet an undisclosed one, was very, very interesting indeed, and really shows how this thread of government interest seems to ask the same questions but never quite get the right answers. And that's a theme that we notice throughout all of the characters and events through this episode. So I could talk for hours about more people and bring in folks like Gary Nolan and do a thing about Bigelow, but I think this is a good place to tie it in. I think we've made our original point that UAP and studies of the paranormal are not fringe. They are publicly derided and treated as nothing worth more than your laughter. But what is fringe is actually a secret frontier of technological and cultural development that our military and technological institutions have been fascinated and very heavily invested in for a very long time. And I don't see that ending anytime soon. I hope you really enjoyed this series. I mean, I really did, and I've learned a ton, which is why they've taken a bit longer to make. Like I said, if you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link below. I'm really glad you're here. And if you want to see more or a particular avenue, then let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon.